Ireland, a small island on the edge of Europe, yet a land with one of the most dramatic stories in human history. From ancient Celtic tribes and mystic druids, to Viking raids, Norman invasions, brutal famines, rebellions, and the long struggle for independence, Ireland's history is a tale of resilience, tragedy, and triumph. This is not just the story of kings and battles, but of poets, rebels, and ordinary people who refuse to be broken. Today, we journey through thousands of years, the entire history of Ireland, from its mysterious beginnings to the modern nation we know today. Long before castles, before kings, before even the name Ireland existed, there was an island shrouded in mist, where the Atlantic winds carried whispers of legend. Archaeologists tell us that the first people arrived here over 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Imagine it, a small group of hunter-gatherers crossing from what is now Britain, paddling in crude skin-covered boats. They stepped onto rocky shores, where dense forests covered the land, and giant elk roamed the valleys. For thousands of years, life was simple but harsh: fishing, hunting, carving out an existence at the edge of the known world. But as centuries passed, Ireland transformed. By around 1400 BC, farming communities spread across the island. These early settlers left behind some of the most mysterious monuments in Europe: standing stones, passage tombs, and circles that still defy full explanation. At Newgrange, older than the pyramids of Egypt, they built a massive tomb aligned with the rising sun of the winter solstice. On that one day each year, sunlight floods the dark chamber, connecting the living with the dead in a ritual of cosmic renewal. Imagine the awe, the fear, the devotion of those who stood outside in the freezing December dawn, waiting for light to pierce the darkness. Centuries rolled on. By around 500 BC, a new people had arrived, the Celts. Fierce warriors, master metalworkers, and storytellers, they brought with them a culture that would define Ireland for over 1,000 years. The Celts spoke an early form of the Irish language. They worshipped gods of the rivers, forests, and sky, and presiding over them were the mysterious druids, priests, judges, and keepers of sacred knowledge. This was not a centralized kingdom, but a patchwork of tuatha, small tribal communities, each ruled by a chieftain. Alliances shifted constantly. Cattle were wealth. Honor was everything. And stories, passed down by bards and poets, carried more power than swords. And from this world came the legends we still know today: Cuchulainn, the boy warrior who single-handedly held off an army; the Fianna, a band of hunters led by Finn Mac Cumhaill; and the mystical cycle of the Tuatha De Danann, gods who once walked among mortals. To the Celts, myth and history were woven together. Every hill, every river had a story. But the Celtic world was not frozen in myth. It was real, brutal, and deeply human. Raids and feuds were constant. Power was fragile. And while Rome conquered much of Europe, Ireland remained beyond its reach. The Romans called it Hibernia, the land of winter, and never invaded. Ireland grew in isolation, preserving its Celtic culture even as the ancient world around it collapsed. And that isolation set the stage for something extraordinary, because soon, Ireland would enter a new age, one of saints, scholars, and a spiritual revolution that would shape not just the island, but all of Europe. Fade to black. A new sound rises, the toll of distant church bells. The year is 432 AD. A lone figure, dressed in simple robes, lands on the shores of Ireland. His name will echo through history: Patrick. At this time, Ireland was still a land of Celtic gods, druids, and warrior kings. But into this world stepped St. Patrick, a former slave turned missionary. His story is one of the most remarkable in history. Kidnapped as a teenager and taken to Ireland in chains, he eventually escaped, only to return years later, not with an army, but with faith. Patrick preached Christianity, not by destroying Ireland's culture, but by weaving it into something new. He used the shamrock, a humble three-leafed plant, to explain the Christian Trinity. He confronted druids with courage, winning respect even among rivals. Slowly, tribe by tribe, Ireland embraced this new faith. But what happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Ireland, untouched by the Roman Empire and spared its collapse, became a beacon of learning while the rest of Europe sank into the Dark Ages. Across the Green Hills, monasteries sprang up: Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Armagh. These were not just religious sites, but centers of art, education, and culture. Monks copied sacred texts, not only the Bible but also Greek and Roman works that might otherwise have been lost forever. In quiet candlelit rooms, with ink and parchment, they preserved the memory of civilizations. The monks also created some of the most stunning works of medieval art. The Book of Kells, with its swirling Celtic designs, vibrant colors, and intricate patterns, remains one of the world's greatest manuscripts. It was more than writing, it was faith turned into beauty. Ireland gained a new title: the land of saints and scholars. Missionaries from Ireland traveled across Europe, founding monasteries in Britain, France, and beyond. Some historians even argue that Ireland helped save Western civilization, keeping knowledge alive until the rest of Europe was ready to rise again. But beneath this golden age, Ireland was still divided. Dozens of kings ruled small kingdoms, constantly feuding. Monasteries, though sacred, were not immune. They often grew wealthy and became tempting targets for raids. And on the horizon, new enemies were stirring. From across the sea, longships would soon appear. The age of peace, prayer, and scholarship was about to be shattered by the thunder of wars and the clash of steel. The screen darkens, the sound of waves, the beat of drums, and then the howl of a Viking horn. The year is 795. On a quiet island off the Irish coast, monks kneel in prayer. Suddenly, a horn sounds. A shadow rises on the horizon, sleek, dragon-headed ships cutting through the waves. Moments later, the monastery is engulfed in fire. Ireland has just entered the Viking Age. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland struck Lambay Island in 795. For the monks who lived there, it was terror like nothing they had ever known. The Norsemen came swiftly, armed with axes and swords, showing no mercy. They plundered treasures, gold chalices, reliquaries, manuscripts, and left behind blood and ruin. And this was just the beginning. Over the next decades, Viking longships became a nightmare along Ireland's coasts and rivers. Monasteries, the jewels of Ireland's golden age, were frequent targets. Places like Iona, Kildare, and Clonmacnoise, once centers of peace and learning, became scenes of slaughter. To the Irish, the Vikings seemed like demons. They called them Lochlanach, men from the land of lakes, and their sudden attacks left the island in constant fear. But the Vikings were not just raiders. They were explorers, traders, settlers, and over time, their presence in Ireland grew deeper. By the early 9th century, they began to establish longforts, fortified ship bases along the rivers. From these bases, they could raid further inland or trade with local tribes. One of these longforts would become something far greater, a settlement on the River Liffey called Dublin, the Blackpool. This was the birth of Dublin, today Ireland's capital. At first, the Vikings and Irish clashed relentlessly. Irish kings launched counterattacks, and in 845, the legendary High King Mael Secnail even captured a Viking leader, drowning him as a warning. But the Norse kept coming. Their ships were fast, their warriors brutal, and their hunger for wealth unending. And yet, as decades passed, something remarkable happened. The line between Viking and Irish began to blur. Many Vikings settled permanently, marrying into Irish families, adopting the Gaelic language, and even converting to Christianity. A new hybrid culture began to form, Norse Gaelic. By the 10th century, Dublin was no longer just a Viking base. It had grown into a thriving town, buzzing with markets, craftsmen, and merchants. Exotic goods flowed through its docks, silver from the Middle East, silk from the east, furs from the north. Dublin became one of the most important trading hubs in the Viking world, but power was never stable in medieval Ireland. Dublin itself changed hands multiple times, sometimes ruled by Viking kings, sometimes captured by Irish high kings. One of the most famous Viking rulers was Olaf Cuaran, a cunning king who played Irish clans against each other to keep control of the city. Still, the Irish never forgot the devastation of the raids. Every monastery burned, every village plundered, left scars that lasted for generations. For centuries, the memory of Viking brutality haunted Irish storytelling. And yet, history is never one-sided. The Vikings also left a legacy that would shape Ireland forever. They introduced new shipbuilding techniques, expanded trade networks, and gave Ireland its first real urban centers. Without them, Dublin and the very idea of Irish cities might never have existed. The clash of Norse and Irish reached its climax in 1014, at the legendary Battle of Clontarf. Here, the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, led his forces against a Viking and Leinster alliance just outside Dublin. The fighting was fierce, brutal, and decisive. Brian's army crushed the Viking forces, though Brian himself was killed, reportedly while praying in his tent after the battle. Clontarf has often been remembered as the moment Ireland drove out the Vikings, but the truth is more complex. By then, many Vikings had already been absorbed into Irish society. Clontarf was less about Ireland versus the Norse, and more about rival Irish kingdoms fighting for dominance, with Viking factions caught in the middle. Still, the symbolism was powerful. The foreign raiders who once terrorized Ireland had been broken. The Irish had survived. Yet in a twist of fate, just as the Vikings were fading, another wave of invaders was preparing to land. This time, they would not just raid and settle, they would seek to conquer. And unlike the Vikings, they would not be absorbed so easily. The sound of hoofbeats, the flutter of banners. The Normans are coming. The year is 1169. Along the southern coast of Ireland, ships appear once again. But these are not Viking longships. These vessels carry knights in shining armor, mounted warriors, and banners bearing strange coats of arms. The Normans have arrived, and Ireland will never be the same. The story begins not with invasion, but with betrayal. Ireland in the 12th century was still a land of fractured kingdoms. Dozens of petty kings ruled their territories, constantly feuding and fighting for supremacy. Among them was Diarmait mac Murchada, the ousted king of Leinster. Desperate to reclaim his throne, he made a fateful decision. He sought help from across the sea. In 1167, Diarmait traveled to England, where he met King Henry II. But it was not the king himself who answered his call, it was a Norman lord, Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow. Strongbow struck a deal. He would help Diarmait regain Leinster, and in return, he would marry Diarmait's daughter Aoife, securing claims to his kingdom. When the Norman knights landed in Ireland in 1169, they were unlike anything the Irish had ever faced. Clad in chainmail, wielding heavy swords and crossbows, mounted on powerful warhorses, they brought a new style of warfare. The Irish, who relied on swift raids and light infantry, were stunned by the sheer power of the Norman cavalry. The Normans quickly seized Wexford, then Waterford, and finally, Dublin itself, once the proud Viking city, now under Norman control. Diarmait was restored as King of Leinster, but the true victor was Strongbow, whose marriage to Aoife secured his family's hold over Irish land. But word of these victories alarmed King Henry II. He feared that his ambitious Norman barons might carve out their own independent kingdoms in Ireland, just as they had done in England and Wales. To prevent this, Henry himself crossed the Irish Sea in 1171 with a massive army. No Irish king dared to oppose him directly. For the first time, an English monarch set foot on Irish soil and claimed overlordship of the island. From this moment, Ireland was tied to England. At first, Henry allowed Irish kings to keep their lands, demanding only loyalty. But gradually, the Normans expanded their control. They built massive stone castles, Trim, Kilkenny, Carrickfergus, fortresses that still stand today, symbols of conquest carved into the Irish landscape. The Normans also brought new towns, markets, and feudal laws. For the first time, Ireland saw walled cities, bustling with merchants and craftsmen. The Irish world of cattle wealth and shifting alliances was slowly being replaced by a feudal order of lords, vassals, and taxes. Yet, conquest was never complete. Beyond the walls of Norman towns and castles, much of Ireland remained in Gaelic hands. In fact, over time, many Normans themselves began to go native. They married into Irish families, spoke the Gaelic language, and even followed Irish customs. By the 14th century, an English official complained that the descendants of Norman settlers had become more Irish than the Irish themselves. To the English crown, this was unacceptable. They passed laws like the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, forbidding English settlers from adopting Irish dress, language, or customs. But these laws were impossible to enforce. Ireland remained a divided land, Norman castles and towns in the east, Gaelic clans dominating the west and north. This uneasy balance lasted for centuries. But as the medieval world gave way to the modern era, England would return with renewed determination. The Tudors, with their ambition for empire, saw Ireland not as a patchwork of kingdoms, but as a territory to be conquered, controlled, and remade. And for Ireland, this would mean rebellions, plantations, and a bitter struggle that would echo through the centuries. The camera lingers on the ruins of a Norman castle. Wind whistles through broken towers. A voice whispers, more Irish than the Irish themselves. Fade to black. By the 1500s, the medieval world was dying. Gunpowder, printing presses, and exploration were reshaping Europe. And in England, a new dynasty had risen, the Tudors. With their ambition for power, they would forever change Ireland. For centuries after the Norman invasion, Ireland had remained divided. English kings claimed lordship, but in reality, most of the island was ruled by Gaelic clans and Anglo-Norman families who had gone native. Only the area around Dublin, known as the Pale, was firmly under English control. But the Tudors were different. Henry VIII, fiery and ambitious, wanted to bring all of Ireland under his crown. In 1541, he declared himself King of Ireland, not just Lord. This was more than a title, it was a statement that Ireland would be absorbed into England's growing kingdom. Religion made the divide sharper. Henry broke from the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England. But in Ireland, most people remained staunchly Catholic. What began as a political conquest quickly became a religious conflict that would last for centuries. The Tudors sought to pacify Ireland through a mix of diplomacy and force. Some Irish lords were offered English titles if they submitted to the crown. Others resisted, and resistance meant blood. One of the most famous uprisings was the Desmond rebellions in the late 1500s. The powerful Earl of Desmond in Munster rose against English rule, supported by Irish lords and even Spanish allies. The rebellion was crushed brutally. English forces burned crops, destroyed villages, and carried out massacres. The once prosperous lands of Munster were left in ruins. And then came the policy that would reshape Ireland forever: plantations. After crushing rebellion, the English confiscated vast tracts of land from Irish lords and handed them to loyal settlers from England and Scotland. These settlers were meant to be Protestant, loyal to the crown, and a permanent presence in Ireland. The first large-scale plantation was in Munster, after the Desmond rebellions. But the greatest and most infamous plantation would come later, in Ulster. The spark came with the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603. At its heart was the great Gaelic leader Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who united Irish lords in a desperate struggle to drive out English control. At first, the Irish achieved stunning victories, even crushing English forces at the Battle of Yellow Ford in 1598, but the tide turned. In 1601, at the Battle of Kinsale, Irish hopes collapsed. Spanish reinforcements had arrived, but the combined Irish-Spanish army was decisively defeated. In the aftermath, the old Gaelic order disintegrated. O'Neill submitted, and in 1607, the flight of the Earls took place. Ireland's leading Gaelic nobles fled into exile in Europe, leaving their lands vulnerable. The English seized the moment. In Ulster, the crown confiscated huge territories and planted them with settlers from England and Scotland. The plantation of Ulster transformed the north. New Protestant towns like Londonderry and Enniskillen rose, while the native Irish were driven to the poorest lands. For the ordinary Irish, the impact was devastating. Families who had held their land for generations were displaced. Ancient clan systems collapsed. Tensions between native Catholics and Protestant settlers deepened, planting the seeds of conflict that would echo for centuries. Yet, even in defeat, Irish identity endured. Songs and stories kept the memory of the lost Gaelic lords alive. Catholic faith became a rallying point of resistance. And though the Tudors had tightened their grip, Ireland remained restless, rebellious, and divided. By the early 1600s, the medieval Ireland of chieftains and bards was gone. In its place stood a land scarred by conquest, reshaped by plantations, and trapped in a conflict of religion and identity. And soon, Ireland would be swept into even greater storms as civil wars raged in Britain, and a ruthless general named Oliver Cromwell would bring terror to Irish shores. The sound of marching boots, drums beat, smoke and fire rise over a darkened landscape. Ireland's tragedy is far from over. Imagine a land of green fields and rolling hills. Now imagine those fields lying silent, their crops rotting in the ground, the air filled with the stench of decay. In the 1840s, Ireland was struck by a disaster so vast, so cruel, that it scarred the nation forever: the Great Famine. In the early 19th century, Ireland was one of the poorest corners of Europe, yet also one of the most densely populated. By 1845, over 8 million people lived on the island. The vast majority were poor tenant farmers, working land they did not own. Their survival depended on a single crop, the potato. Cheap, nutritious, and able to grow in small plots of land, the potato sustained millions. For many families, it was not just a staple food, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But this dependence made Ireland dangerously vulnerable. Then, in the autumn of 1845, disaster struck. A strange blight, carried on the wind, blackened the leaves and turned the potatoes into a foul-smelling mush. Entire harvests failed. At first, many thought it was a fluke. But the blight returned, year after year. By the late 1840s, famine had gripped the land. Hunger turned daily life into a nightmare. Families scavenged for nettles, weeds, even seaweed to survive. Villages were filled with the hollow-eyed starving, their bodies wasted, their skin clinging to their bones. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and cholera spread through weakened communities, killing thousands. The response from the British government was tragically inadequate. Ireland was then part of the United Kingdom, ruled from London. Relief efforts were minimal, and often cruelly mismanaged. Soup kitchens opened, but many closed too soon. Workhouses offered food in exchange for labor, but conditions inside were brutal, overcrowded, and rife with disease. Worse still, food exports from Ireland continued. While millions starved, grain, cattle, and butter were shipped abroad to Britain. To many, this felt like not just neglect, but betrayal. The human toll was staggering. Between 1845 and 1852, over 1 million people died from hunger, disease, or the sheer exhaustion of poverty. Another 2 million fled, emigrating to Britain, America, Canada, and Australia. The famine emptied entire villages. Roads were lined with makeshift coffins. Families were torn apart forever. The journey of those who left was no less tragic. Packed into coffin ships, desperate emigrants sailed for America. Disease swept through the crowded holds, killing thousands before they even saw land. For those who survived, the New World offered both hope and hardship. Irish immigrants faced prejudice and poverty, but they carried with them their culture, their faith, and their determination to survive. The famine changed Ireland forever. The population, once over 8 million, collapsed and never recovered. By the 20th century, it had fallen below 3 million. Entire generations were lost. The Irish language, once dominant, declined sharply as English became the language of survival and opportunity abroad. But the famine also lit a fire of resistance. For many, the tragedy revealed the injustice of British rule. Resentment grew, feeding movements for independence. The memory of hunger and abandonment fueled a determination that Ireland would one day govern itself. And for the millions who emigrated, the famine became a shared wound that connected Irish communities across the globe. In the slums of New York, the factories of Boston, the goldfields of Australia, and the streets of London, Irish immigrants carried their history with them. Songs, stories, and traditions became lifelines, preserving identity far from home. Today, the famine is remembered not only as a tragedy but as a turning point. It is etched into Irish memory, a reminder of suffering but also of survival. On the quays of Dublin, a haunting famine memorial shows gaunt figures clutching their children, walking toward ships that would take them far from home. The famine did not just change Ireland, it changed the world. The Irish diaspora spread across continents, shaping nations, bringing their culture, and ensuring that Ireland's story would never be confined to one island alone. But in Ireland itself, the scars ran deep. The famine left behind a weakened, grieving nation. And in the years that followed, the call for freedom would grow louder, fueled by the memory of hunger and loss. Because if the famine had shown anything, it was that Ireland could not rely on others to protect its people. The struggle for independence had entered a new chapter. The camera fades on a starving child's face, then shifts to a ship sailing across the Atlantic. The wind carries voices, cries of grief, but also songs of survival. A people scattered, but never broken. Ireland in the 19th century was still haunted by the Great Famine. Millions had perished or fled across the Atlantic, but those who remained lived under the shadow of British rule, poverty, and oppression. Yet, from this suffering, a new determination grew. The dream of an independent Ireland, free from London's control, refused to die. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that dream would explode into revolution. The story begins with secret societies and whispers in the night. Groups like the Fenians, named after legendary Irish warriors, plotted in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. Their rebellions often failed, crushed by British soldiers and informants, but the spirit of defiance only grew stronger. Alongside them, politicians like Charles Stewart Parnell pushed for Home Rule, the idea that Ireland could govern itself while still under the crown. Parnell electrified crowds with fiery speeches, yet every attempt at passing Home Rule in Parliament was delayed, blocked, or watered down. For the Irish people, it felt like hope dangled before them, only to be snatched away. Then came 1916. On Easter Monday, as the world was consumed by the First World War, a small band of Irish rebels seized their chance. They stormed the streets of Dublin, taking over the General Post Office and proclaiming the Irish Republic. For 6 days, gunfire rang through the city as British troops fought to retake control. Dublin's streets became a battlefield, smoke, rubble, and bodies marking the cost of rebellion. The leaders of the Easter Rising knew they were outnumbered, yet they stood firm, declaring Ireland's freedom to the world. When the Rising collapsed, its leaders were executed by firing squad. But rather than extinguish the movement, their blood lit a fire across Ireland. The image of men like Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, dying for Ireland's freedom, stirred the nation. Ordinary people, once hesitant, now began to see independence not as a fantasy, but as destiny. By 1919, revolution erupted again. The Irish Republican Army, led by Michael Collins and others, launched a guerrilla war against British forces. Ambushes, assassinations, and raids became daily occurrences. The British responded with brutal force, deploying the feared Black and Tans, irregular soldiers whose harsh tactics terrorized civilians. Towns were burned, homes destroyed, and innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Ireland was bleeding, but it would not submit. The conflict raged until 1921, when a treaty was signed. Ireland would at last have independence, but only as a free state within the British Empire, and only for the southern 26 counties. The 6 counties of Ulster, with their Protestant majority, would remain part of the United Kingdom. For some, this was victory. For others, betrayal. The treaty split Ireland down the middle. Friends became enemies, brothers turned against each other. A brutal civil war followed, pitting pro-treaty forces led by Michael Collins against anti-treaty Republicans. The fighting was savage, and Collins himself was killed in an ambush in 1922, just months after helping to secure independence. His death symbolized the tragic cost of Ireland's freedom, hard-won, yet painfully incomplete. By 1923, the Irish Free State emerged battered but alive. For the first time in centuries, Ireland governed itself. But the scars of division ran deep, and the unresolved question of Northern Ireland would cast a long shadow into the future. Still, the moment was historic. After centuries of conquest, plantations, famine, and rebellion, Ireland had broken free. It was a nation reborn, forged in sacrifice and struggle. The long road to freedom had come at a terrible price, but it had given Ireland its soul. The ink on the Treaty of 1921 may have given Ireland freedom, but it also left behind a wound that refused to heal. The island was split in two, the Irish Free State in the south, and Northern Ireland, 6 counties, still firmly under British rule. This division planted seeds of tension that would grow into one of the darkest chapters in modern Irish history. For decades, the border remained more than just a line on a map. It was a line of identity, religion, and loyalty. In the south, the Free State and later the Republic of Ireland built its fragile independence, slowly moving away from British influence. But in the north, Catholics and Protestants lived side by side in uneasy mistrust. Catholics, who largely saw themselves as Irish, faced discrimination in jobs, housing, and politics under a government dominated by Protestants who identified as British. This imbalance simmered like a hidden fire, waiting for a spark. That spark came in the 1960s. Inspired by the global civil rights movement, Catholics in Northern Ireland began demanding equal rights. Peaceful marches filled the streets, but instead of reform, the response was often police batons, bullets, and escalating anger. Soon, Northern Ireland descended into what the world would come to know as the Troubles. For 3 decades, violence consumed the north. The Irish Republican Army fought for unification with the Republic, while loyalist paramilitaries battled to keep Northern Ireland British. Bombings, assassinations, and riots turned towns and cities into war zones. The British Army patrolled the streets, and fear became part of daily life. Families were torn apart, children grew up surrounded by walls and checkpoints, and thousands of lives were lost. It was a conflict where no side emerged unscarred, and where civilians paid the highest price. Yet even in this darkness, voices for peace refused to stay silent. Politicians, priests, and ordinary citizens worked tirelessly to find a way out. Their efforts bore fruit in 1998, with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. For the first time, both sides agreed to share power, to respect differences, and to end the violence. It was not a perfect solution. Northern Ireland remained part of the UK, but with a framework that allowed for cooperation and a future where unity could be decided peacefully. The Good Friday Agreement marked the beginning of a new chapter. The guns slowly fell silent, and while mistrust lingered, the chance for peace allowed communities to rebuild. Streets once patrolled by soldiers opened to commerce and laughter again. The shadow of war lifted, and Ireland, both north and south, could finally begin to look forward. Meanwhile, in the Republic of Ireland, something remarkable was happening. After centuries of poverty and emigration, the nation experienced an economic boom in the late 20th century, earning the nickname the Celtic Tiger. Modern industries, foreign investment, and a young, educated workforce transformed Ireland into one of Europe's fastest-growing economies. Cities like Dublin became hubs of technology and culture, while Irish music, film, and literature found audiences worldwide. But Ireland's story was never just about money. It was about identity. Once defined by colonization and tragedy, Ireland now embraced its heritage proudly. Gaelic traditions, Celtic art, and the Irish language found revival. Millions around the world, from Boston to Sydney, traced their roots back to this island, turning St. Patrick's Day into a global celebration of Irish culture. And yet, Ireland did not forget its struggles. The famine, the rebellions, the partition, and the Troubles, all of it remained part of the national memory. But instead of breaking Ireland, these hardships shaped it into a nation of resilience. A people who endured so much suffering now stood as a symbol of perseverance, hope, and reconciliation. Today, Ireland faces new challenges, debates over unity, shifting global politics, and the lasting ripples of Brexit. The border issue once again looms, reminding everyone that history is never truly past. Yet Ireland moves forward, not backward. The dream of peace, born from centuries of struggle, remains alive. In the end, the history of Ireland is not just the story of kings, battles, or treaties. It is the story of ordinary people, farmers, workers, rebels, mothers, children, who endured conquest, hunger, and violence, yet held on to their identity. They sang their songs, told their stories, and passed down their culture through generations, refusing to be erased. From Celtic warriors to Viking settlers, from Norman lords to English kings, from famine to freedom, from division to peace, Ireland's journey is one of the most extraordinary in human history. A small island, but one whose story has echoed around the world. And as we stand today, looking back across the centuries, one lesson shines brightest: Ireland's past may be scarred by struggle, but its future is proof that even the most divided of peoples can find hope, peace, and prosperity. Ireland's story is one of resilience and hope. If you believe history like this should be remembered, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for the next journey.